I appreciate you taking the time to break through the activity of your week and gather around the Word of God this evening. We are in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. I want to talk to you tonight about the issue of forgiveness. And Paul exercised forgiveness. Now I want you to think about, just for a moment, how we think about forgiveness. The way we usually consider forgiveness in the Christian life is that we think of us being offended and somebody needing to apologize to us so that we can forgive them, or vice versa. We usually think about the fact that somebody has wronged us. They've done something against us, and they've committed some act that has offended us. Tonight we're going to look at us just giving forgiveness. And us giving forgiveness really within ourselves, because we say it a lot, and we say it because it's true. Forgiveness is not so much about those who have hurt you as much as it's about you. You're cleansing within yourself of many negative things because you exercise forgiveness. Certainly in our relationships, we need to give forgiveness when asked, etc., and so forth. I'm not discounting that, but forgiveness really speaks about you giving forgiveness. And we're going to look at, you're not going to see the word forgiveness in this verse, but we're going to look at a verse that Paul uses in this text to show us that he has given forgiveness. Look at what he says, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. At my first answer, and the word answer is defense, and Paul is speaking about the first time he stood and basically had to defend his preaching of the gospel and sharing his faith. At my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. You see, in the first part of the verse, the issue that hurt Paul. You see, in the second part, the evidence that Paul has given forgiveness. So I want us to think about Paul's situation here, and I want to kind of put myself, encourage you to put yourself in Paul's place. Paul was a great man of God, a great sharer of the gospel of Christ, risking his life time and time again to share his faith in Christ, to try to get the gospel story of Jesus dying for our sins, paying our debt before God, and reconciliation with God through what Christ did on the cross. He gave his life to that. He surrounded himself with people who supported him in that, who shared that vision, who desired to do the same. And they had good relationships for the most part, but sometimes, as it always happens with human beings, things break down. You know, even when you come to Christ and you're with Christian people, it doesn't keep you from being human, and things come up. Churches have problems. Churches divide. Christians don't always get along. Someone says, well, that shouldn't be. Yes, it shouldn't be, but people are people. And it happens. And so Paul had these people around him who helped him, encouraged him, but they didn't always do what Paul needed them to do. And in this verse of Scripture, we see a hint of that. Paul says, I had to stand and make my defense of preaching the gospel and sharing Christ. And he says, at that defense, at that answer, he says, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. And then we see the spirit of forgiveness when he says, but I pray to God that it may not be laid to their charge. It's a challenge to face hardships alone. I don't care if it's in the Christian realm or just your life, it's a challenge when you have to face hardships and you are alone. Amen. It's hard to do what's required sometimes in your life when you need the support of people and they are not there and you are left alone. Paul here is talking about that time when he stood making his defense of preaching the gospel and such things, and he says, there was no one with me. No one. No one. I stood alone. You do know, I trust, chapter 4 of 2 Timothy is an interesting chapter. I've shared that with you before because in chapter 4, Paul shares with us some of the challenges that he had. He's lost people who were partners with him in the ministry because, like Demas, has gone astray because he loved the world too much. He talked about people departing even in ministry, and he was left alone. I kind of wonder if that's why it kind of goes back to this time when he made that defense and he was left alone. But Paul had a lot of challenges, and yet within himself, he had a spirit of forgiveness, and that's important. You can be struggling with the issue that you don't have support. You can be struggling with the issue that people don't seem to care, and it should not preclude you from being responsible in your spiritual life and doing what you need to do. Just because people do you wrong doesn't give you and I the right to sit around and say, well, I don't have to have a Christian spirit of forgiveness. On the contrary, the more people do not support us, help us, and maybe do the things that they should in relationship to us, the stronger we need to possess the spirit of forgiveness. Because the last thing you need when you're struggling with your feelings about people not supporting you as they should, not giving you encouragement as maybe you need to have, the last thing you need to do is to become bitter and not forgive people for that. Because you talk about being in a downward spiral spiritually, you're just headed for a deeper hole when you don't have the spirit of forgiveness. So I want to talk about a spirit of forgiveness here. Again, it's not mentioned, but it's evident. I want to, first of all, notice Paul's forgiveness through their faithlessness. People were faithless. He says, no man stood with me. Now, we don't know where these people were, although some of them may have been doing legitimate things, could not be there to support Paul. But Paul's letting us know not one single person stood with me. Notice how emphatic he is there. No man stood with me. You know, have you ever been down in the dumps because people were not supporting you? And you say something, maybe you don't say it audibly, but you say it to yourself. No one cares. You don't say, it doesn't seem to me that most people care. No, you don't do that. You do what I do. You say, no one cares. When Paul says, no man stood with me, kind of gives you an inkling of where he is in dealing emotionally with the fact that people are not faithful to him and with him. I mean, Paul was a faithful companion. Paul appreciated faithfulness in people. Elsewhere, he talks about companions that he had, that he served with, who were faithful. I have no doubt that it was very important. You remember, he told the Corinthians, It is required in a servant or steward that a man be found faithful. He appreciated faithfulness. And when he didn't get it, you can just imagine how hurtful it was. Were they afraid? Were they afraid? We don't know, but some of them were. But it's interesting how the power of faithlessness causes us to get paralyzed. You ever get paralyzed and not help somebody you know they need help? You let maybe your circumstances, your busyness paralyze you. Maybe some of these people that he includes in no man stood with me or no one stood with me, maybe some of them had legitimate reasons. Maybe some of them were just faithless. Maybe some of them were at a time in their life when they had been faithful to Paul, but now for whatever reasons they were not faithful. They were faithless to it. Now, it's easy to forgive people when they do something against you or don't do something for you. It's easy to forgive people when it doesn't matter much to you. But it's hard to forgive people when they have proven to you, at least in your perception, that they're faithless. They don't stand with you. And yet Paul was a man who felt he must forgive. He understood that letting go of that resentment was important to him. It was important to him. And I do want you to understand that some of the people in this very room at some time, when you need them, will probably prove faithless to you. Now, I need to qualify that. I don't think any of us would ever be faithless intentionally toward one another. But you know, I've learned that I disappoint Deidre. We've been married for a long time, and I've learned that I've disappointed her various times. You can't be around people very long, but what you will find that we sometimes prove faithless one to another. Maybe not intentionally, but we don't always stand with each other. Now the question is, you can say, well, we ought always to be faithful. And maybe we should, but the reality is that sometimes we prove faithless. The question is, what are we going to do about it within ourselves? Are we going to give faith, or are we going to give forgiveness when people prove faithless? You know, I've learned in my life that the only person who is defeated when I don't forgive people for their faithlessness is me. It'll destroy you. Paul understood that he had to forgive and he had to let go, or the lack of forgiveness builds resentment. It builds resentment. Paul understood he couldn't have that. No one was to be counted on. No one stood with me. Forgiveness at times needs to happen, not just for what's done to you, but sometimes forgiveness needs to be exercised for what is not done for you. And you have to let it go. You have to let it go. Forgiveness for other people's faithlessness. Faithlessness is to be counted and considered in light of everything. Paul's forgiveness carried him through the faithlessness of other people. And I promise you this, if you haven't discovered it, I think you have, but you're finding more and more in your life that people are proving very much faithless to you. Now, this is not a sermon to excuse it. This is a sermon or a thought to understand it and to give forgiveness when people are faithless, because forgiveness carries you through people's faithlessness in your life. The second thing, his forgiveness through all fearfulness. Because Paul was afraid, to some degree, to have to make his defense. I mean, I know Paul's bold. I know Paul's strong in the Lord and such as that. But let me ask you a question. I want you to think about this. Even though he's bold in the Lord, strong in the Lord, because he goes on to say after these verses, that notwithstanding what people did, the Lord stood with him and strengthened him. So he understood the Lord was with him, and the Lord got him through it. So that's powerful. But do you really think that Paul would be mentioning what he's mentioning about no one standing with him and all men forsaking him if he didn't hurt because people didn't be faithful to him? Sure, we're all hurt when people prove faithless in our lives. And we also know that sometimes people are afraid. You know, just like we live in a day and age where if something's happening just down the street, we're probably going to walk by it. Not many people will get involved because they're afraid. Maybe they're not afraid of the person. If somebody's attacking someone else, maybe they're not afraid to get into the fray or the fight, but they're afraid they might get sued if they have. I mean, there's all kinds of fears that keep us from getting involved. So when Paul says, no one stood with me, but all men forsook me. They fled him. The word there, forsook, basically means deserted. They deserted me. Now, why did they desert him? I don't know every reason, but I have a strong suspicion some of it was fearfulness. And Paul here is left with no one, so that probably ratchets up his fear of having to be by himself to some degree. So the people, his brethren, are afraid because they don't want to get involved, or they're afraid of what might happen to them. And so Paul now, because of that, has a fear of standing by himself. So everybody's afraid. Don't you hate it when, and I'm going to use this word or this statement in quotation marks, when people make you feel a certain way? Now, you understand no one makes you and I feel the way we feel. But that's not how we crouch it. When somebody abandons us, we think, well, they made me feel this way. So why is it important to forgive people? Because if you think they're abandoning you, they're deserting you, their fear of being associated with you or paying the price of helping you, whatever the case is, when you think that you're filled with fear because of their abandonment, boy, that easily leads to resentment and frustration. And Paul says they forsook me. But he said, I have to forgive them. Because if I don't forgive them, then my resentment makes me even more afraid. Makes me even more fearful. So notice how, whereas in the first statement, when he said, no man stood with me, notice how extensive this second statement is. But all forsook me. Notice all, everybody, everyone. Not one person stood with me, emphatically, not one. And now all, exclusive of everyone, he says, forsook me. Notice how personal and individual that is. The absence of support in their fear would help fuel fear in Paul himself. And Paul's recounting that because Paul's maybe not in the best places right now. In context of chapter 4, Paul shares his loneliness, his sense of discouragement. And, when you're down and discouraged, it's easy to just reinforce it. It's really easy to reinforce it. And that's why forgiveness is very important. for you in those times. To forgive people for their faithlessness. To forgive people for their fear, controlling them and keeping them from supporting you. It's interesting because I think this is involved in Paul's thoughts here. Their love for him, which I believe they had, but their love for him was not such that it would overcome their own fears to be there and encourage him. See, that is sometimes a very sad thing to realize when people abandon you and desert you. That their love for you, which these brethren of Paul, and these are Christian brethren, not unbelievers, Christian brethren, their love for Paul, which no doubt they had, was not enough to compel them to deal with their own fears and be there for Paul, overcome their own fears to encourage him. They let their fears override their love for him. And that's a dangerous, sad thing for somebody to know and experience.
Amen.
But we've all experienced it. And if you haven't, you will. So you better get ready for it. Because people's love for you will, and I'm not questioning that love, but their love for you may not always overcome their fear of what is required for them to encourage you to be there. And what are you going to do then? Well, you can go in the downward spiral of how sad it is and how bad it is for you, or you can say, I forgive them, and start spiritually taking care of you. You see, this issue of forgiveness is very important because forgiveness is the power of your spiritual health. Many other things are too, but forgiveness is very essential for you and your spiritual health. And Paul says, I forgive them, even though I know their love for me, and it's there, was not sufficient to overcome their fear to be there and help me. He forgives them. Though it renders him more challenged, he forgives them. Though it still leaves him alone, he forgives them. Though he still has to realize that they, in their lack of support for him, let their fears override their love for him, he still forgives them. So his forgiveness rides him through the fearfulness that they had and that he now has because they left him alone. The third thing is his forgiveness through his fickleness. And that's not a good word, but it has an F on it. So it is useful. But it is a good word in the sense that Paul knows himself well enough to know what he has to do to maintain his own spiritual health. And Deidre and I were talking about something just the other day, and I never really had thought about it until we got to talking about this issue, or something made us talk about it. And I can't remember how I phrased it, but more I thought about it, more I think it is true. That maturity in your Christian life is not you really changing God as much as you changing yourself to God. When you're spiritually immature, you naturally have some thoughts about God that are not right. You think God ought to do everything that you want him to, and God ought to operate according to your time frame and all that. Now, you probably won't ever change those thoughts. And what I mean by that is I've been a child of God since I was about 6 years old. I've been preaching a long time. And I preach patience, and I preach a lot of virtues that are out there for the Christian life. But I still have the same issues I've always had. Particularly, as I'm thinking about them, God never moves fast enough for me. Never. And always, every phase of my Christian life, have had to grapple with the issue of why does God let bad things happen to me? When people say, why does a loving God allow such and such to happen in the world? I understand that question because I've always struggled with that. And I have a feeling I'm going to always struggle with that. I don't think I'm ever going to get some of those things down. But maturity makes you understand that the solving of that issue isn't that God answers to you and tells you what you want to know. That's not maturity. Maturity is me saying, okay, I've got these questions, I've got these issues, but I've got to change myself toward the Lord, and it's just got to be all right, because God, I'm not God. He owes me nothing. You see, maturity means that I get over my spiritual fickleness. It's not that I serve God because He always works everything out in my life. It's not why I serve Him. I don't serve God because He answers my questions, and I certainly don't serve God because when I say, God, get on it, He gets right on it. That's not why I serve God. But if I'm fickle toward God, if I'm fickle toward my Christian life, then all that is riding the roller coaster, up and down, back and forth. Now notice what Paul says. But I pray God that it might not be laid to their charge. How we forgive reveals our spiritual health. His words here in this statement show that he is over beyond himself. It's not about him anymore. And one of the things in your spiritual maturity, and one of the great things that forgiving people can do for you, is it gets you beyond you. Have you ever heard anyone say, well, so-and-so did me wrong, and I can forgive, but I can never forget? Meaning that I reserve the right to hold this resentment in my heart. Well, they'll never get anywhere. Paul says, I got to let this thing go. That's not good English. But I have to let this thing go. It's not about me, it's about them. Did they do me wrong by not standing with me and deserting me? Yes. Yes. But I just ask God to forgive them. It's not about me and my hurt feelings. It's about them and their relationship with God. Notice that. In that statement, I pray God that it might not be laid to their charge. He is seeking their restoration, and he is seeking their spiritual help, and he realizes that their failure is really a sign of spiritual weakness. When you forgive, it's amazing how it takes your mind off of you and puts your mind toward other people and their spiritual well-being. Forgiveness does that. Resentment won't ever get there. Bitterness won't ever get there. Maturity in the Apostle Paul made him set aside his fickleness within himself, forgive, and to seek the well-being of other people in relationship to the Lord. If you want to be happy, I remember years ago, it used to be a popular song in the 50s. If you want to be happy for the rest of your life, never make a pretty woman your wife. The guys that wrote that probably were not married. But if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, then understand this isn't about you. It's not about me. It's about how we bring about help to the spiritual well-being of other people. And when you get interested in other people's spiritual well-being, especially in the hours when they've hurt you, when they've abandoned you, when they didn't stand with you, when they weren't what they should have been. No, they weren't what they should have been. But you reacted to it not in a fickle way of saying, well, they hurt my feelings, I'm never going to love them, I won't trust them, all that kind of stuff we do. Then spiritually they aren't benefited, and you're sure not. But when you live, as Paul did, with the spirit of forgiveness, and you seek other people